Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem Sikaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Harigor Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shai Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan ki jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Mayapur Dham ki jai. Jagannath Puri ki jai. Ganga Mai ki jai, Jamuna Mai ki jai, Tulsi Maharani ki jai, Bhakti Devi ki jai, Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Today we're continuing with the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Volume 2. Written by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami. We're on the chapter entitled, Stay High Forever. Srila Prabhupada was now introducing the Harinam Sankirtan party for the first time in the Western countries. His first attempt was at another park, Washington Square Park. That was the first place that Prabhupada went. And now he's going somewhere a little closer to 26 Second Avenue called Tompkins Square Park. And this is the first time that Prabhupada's taking the devotees there. While Prabhupada was sitting there, because it was a Sunday afternoon, a lot of people come, they enjoy the weather there, and they move around in the park. And amongst them, there were many musicians. So one of them, who happened to see Srila Prabhupada and the devotees, his name was Irving Halpern. So we're getting a little view of how Irving Halpern saw the first chanting of Hare Krishna in Tompkins Square Park. Irving says, a lot of people had spectacularized notions of what a Swami was, as though they were going to suddenly see people lying on little mattresses made out of nails and all kinds of other absurd notions. Yet here come just a very graceful, peaceful, gentle, obviously well-meaning being into a lot of hostility. Now, because it was a mix of many different genres of human beings at that park, including a lot of local slum dwellers and immigrants who didn't understand anything about the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, they had their, as soon as they saw Srila Prabhupada and the devotees dressed a little funny, they immediately made their preconceptions. So some of them called them hippies, and some of them asked, what are they, communists? Because they had never seen anything like devotees before. While the young taunted, the middle-aged and elderly shook their heads or stared, cold and uncomprehending. The way to the park was spotted with blasphemies, ribald jokes, and tension, but no violence. After the successful kirtan in Washington Square Park, Prabhupada had regularly been sending out parades of 3 or 4 devotees, chanting Hare Krishna and playing hand cymbals through the streets and sidewalks of the Lower East Side. On one occasion, they had been bombarded with water balloons and eggs, and they were sometimes faced with bullies looking for a fight. But they were never attacked, just stared at, laughed at, or shouted after. Today, the ethnic neighbors just assumed that Prabhupada and his followers had come onto the streets dressed in outlandish costumes as a joke, just to turn everything topsy-turvy and cause stares and howls. They felt that their responses were only natural for any normal, respectable American slum dweller. So we had in this Lower East Side at the time a lot of immigrants coming from Puerto Rico, coming from Ukraine, from Germany. A lot of Jews were just in the next street down on Hester Street. And no one had ever seen anything like Srila Prabhupada and the devotees before. They couldn't quite register where these people had come from. So they had their conceptions of why they had come dressed like this at their park, Tompkins Square Park. So these are some of the Ukrainian ladies talking to each other, giving each other information about what these strange people must be. So it was quite an adventure before the group even reached the park. Swamiji, however, remained unaffected. "What are they saying?" he asked once or twice, and Brahmananda explained. Prabhupada had a way of holding his head high, his chin up, as he walked forward. It made him look aristocratic and determined. His vision was spiritual. He saw everyone as a spirit soul and Krishna as the controller of everything. Yet aside from that, even from the worldly point of view, he was unafraid of the city's pandemonium. After all, he was an experienced Calcutta man. So Prabhupada had grown up in Calcutta, which at that time was the British capital of their whole Asian empire. And he saw a lot of cosmopolitan, different genres of society there in Calcutta. You had the Chinese, you had the Bengalis, you had people coming from all over the world because the British had made Calcutta into a big trade center. So Prabhupada, he was accustomed to a lot of variety in the social stratum. But now he was the one being looked at and being pointed to. And therefore, as he was walking along with his disciples and his followers, he was curious to know what they were saying about the group. And he inquired from Brahmananda. The kirtan had been going for about 10 minutes when Swamiji arrived. Stepping out of his white rubber slippers, just as if he were home in the temple, he sat down on the rug with his followers, who had now stopped their singing and were watching him. He wore a pink sweater and round his shoulders a khadi wrapper. He smiled. Looking at his group, he indicated the rhythm by counting. 1, 2, 3. Then he began clapping his hands heavily as he continued counting. 1, 2, 3. So Prabhupada was setting the beat of the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. The kartals followed, at first with wrong beats, but he kept the rhythm by clapping his hands, and then they got it, clapping hands, clashing cymbals artlessly to a slow, steady beat. He began singing prayers that no one else knew. Bandeham Shiguro Shijuta Parakamalam Shigurun Vaishnavangscha. His voice was sweet like the harmonium, rich in the nuances of Bengali melody. Sitting on the rug under a large oak tree, he sang the mysterious Sanskrit prayers. None of his followers knew any mantra but Hare Krishna, but they knew Swamiji, and they kept the rhythm, listening closely to him while the trucks rumbled on the street and the conga drums pulsed in the distance. Conga drums are big drums from some other part of the world, either Africa or some Hispanic country. And because the musicians used to come to the park and play their music together, in other parts of the park there was music going on. As he sang Shri Rupam Sagrajatam, the dogs came by, kids stared, a few mockers pointed fingers. Hey, who's that priest, man? But his voice was a shelter beyond the clashing dualities. His boys went on ringing cymbals while he sang alone. Shri Radha Krishna Padan. Prabhupada sang prayers in praise of the pure conjugal love of Srimati Radharani for Krishna, the beloved of the gopis. Each word passed down for hundreds of years by the intimate associates of Krishna was saturated with deep transcendental meaning that only he understood. Sahagana Lalita Shri Visakanvitancha. They waited for him to begin Hare Krishna, although hearing him chant was exciting enough. More people came, which was what Prabhupada wanted. He wanted them chanting and dancing with him, and now his followers wanted that too. They wanted to be with him. They had tried together at the UN, Ananda Ashram, and Washington Square Park. It seemed that this would be the thing they would always do, go with Swamiji and sit and chant. He would always be with them chanting. So we can remember from previous readings that Prabhupada had been invited by Mr. Bogart to come to a big peace vigil at the front of the United Nations building. And Prabhupada came there expecting to hold kirtan. But when he began chanting with his disciples, they stopped him. They said, no, this is a silent vigil. You can't chant. So Prabhupada had everyone just chant japa. And then at Ananda Ashram, he was specifically invited by Dr. Mishra. And then when Dr. Mishra wasn't there, Dr. Mishra's disciples would also invite him purely for the purpose of holding kirtan. They liked his kirtan. And Prabhupada was able to get everyone, even the old ladies, everyone, even the middle-aged men, got them all to dance with him. Then the first being Washington Square Park, that was the first place where they had the Harinam Sankirtan. Now at last Prabhupada found a very good place to hold Sankirtan at Tompkins Square Park. Then he began the mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. They responded, too low and muddled at first, but he returned it to them again, singing it right and triumphant. Again they responded, gaining heart, ringing kartals and clapping hands. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Again he sang it alone, and they stayed, hanging closely on each word, clapping, beating cymbals, and watching him looking back at them from his inner concentration, his old age wisdom, his bhakti, and out of love for Swamiji, they broke loose from their surroundings and joined him as a chanting congregation. Swamiji played his small drum, holding its strap in his left hand, bracing the drum against his body, and with his right hand playing intricate mridanga rhythms. Prabhupada just had a one-sided bongo drum at that time, so he would have to hold it on one side and then play his rhythms on the other side. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. He was going strong after half an hour, repeating the mantra, carrying them with him as interested onlookers gathered in greater numbers. A few hippies sat down on the edge of the rug, copying the cross-legged sitting posture, listening, clapping, trying the chanting, and the small inner circle of Prabhupada and his followers grew as gradually more people joined. As always, his kirtan attracted musicians. Now Irving Halpern is giving his observation again, the musician. I make flutes and I play musical instruments. There are all kinds of different instruments that I make. When the Swami came, I went up and started playing, and he welcomed me. Whenever a new musician would join and play their first note, he would extend his arms. It would be as though he had stepped up to the podium and was going to lead the New York Philharmonic. I mean, there was this gesture that every musician knows. You just know when someone else wants you to play with them, and feels good that you are playing with them. And this very basic kind of musician communication was there with him. And I related to it very quickly, and I was happy about it. So of course, Prabhupada, he once said that there's a class of people that due to their karma, they never leave New York City. So New York is like a planet in itself. It's also called the Big Apple. And all different types of people live in New York City, and they have their specific New York culture. And along with that culture, they also have a lot of classical culture as well. So in the opera houses, there's the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. And that's all classical music, playing Mozart and Bach and the other classical musicians. And there's a maestro, an orchestrator, and he leads the different musical instruments playing the different melodies of these classical musicians. So sometimes he has a stick, and he will lead where now the flutists start, then the violins start, then the drums start, and he leads the music like that. It's a proper orchestra. And Prabhupada, because from his childhood, his father insisted that he learn mridanga. He knew so many bhajans also. He and his sister used to sing. And music was a part of his life. So when these young men and women came close to Prabhupada and sat down and brought their musical instruments, he knew exactly how to welcome them by raising his arms to them and bringing them in to the musical experience that they were all having by the chanting of Hare Krishna. Lone musicians were always loitering in different parts of the park, and when they heard they could play with the Swamis chanting and that they were welcome, then they began to come by, one by one. A saxophone player came just because there was such a strong rhythm section to play with. Saxophone is it's a brass instrument. There's nothing really like it here in India. You have a lot of different, it's like a very thick, long flute. Others, like Irving Halpern, saw it as something spiritual with good vibrations. As the musicians joined, more passers-by were drawn into the kirtan. Prabhupada had been singing both lead and chorus, and many who had joined now sang the lead part also, so that there was a constant chorus of chanting. During the afternoon, the crowd grew to more than 100, with a dozen musicians trying with their conga and bongo drums, bamboo flutes, metal flutes, mouth organs, wood and metal clackers, tambourines, and guitars to stay with the Swami. It was becoming a real event for all the musicians there. Irving again. The park resounded. The musicians were very careful in listening to the mantras. When the Swami sang Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, there was sometimes a Krishna, a tripling of what had been a double syllable. It would be usually on the first stanza, because you'll see here, Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. And the musicians really picked up on it. The Swami would pronounce it in a particular way, and the musicians were really meticulous and listened very carefully to the way the Swami would sing. And we began to notice that there were different melodies for the same brief sentence. And we got to count on that one regularity, like one would count on the conductor of an orchestra or the lead singer of a madrigal. It was really pleasant, and the people would dig one another in their ribs. They would say, "Hey, see?" We would catch and repeat a particular subtle pronunciation of a Sanskrit phrase that the audience, in their enthusiasm, while they would be dancing or playing, had perhaps missed. Or the Swami would add an extra beat, but it meant something, in the way in which the drummer, who at that time was the Swami, the main drummer, would hit the drums. So the musicians, just as when Prabhupada first moved to the Bowery, a lot of musicians lived there, including Michael Green, who became Mukunda Das. So he had all of his musicians come, and they were jamming with Prabhupada. I mean, they were coming for the music, because musicians really like to get into the rhythm and the beat, and they noticed all these different stanza changes and extra beats Prabhupada put in. It's like a language in itself, the music. So they were appreciating the music. At the same time, they were all getting purified by the chanting of Hare Krishna. I have talked to a couple of musicians about it, and we agreed that in his head, this Swami must have had hundreds and hundreds of melodies that had been brought back from the real learning from the other side of the world. So many people came there just to tune in to the musical gift, the transmission of the Dharma. Hey, they would say, listen to this holy monk. People were really sure that there were going to be unusual feats, grandstanding, flashy levitation, or whatever else people expected was going to happen. But when the simplicity of what the Swami was really saying, when you began to sense it, whether you were motivated to actually make a lifetime commitment and go this way of life, or whether you merely wanted to appreciate it and place it in a place and give certain due respect to it, it turned you around. So naturally, when Srila Prabhupada and his devotees first went out on the street, because it was completely new to the American culture, no one quite understood why Prabhupada was sitting down and singing, and then that everyone was dancing like that. But the power of the holy name is so strong that they were immediately attracted, for whatever reason it was, whether they were going to make a commitment or not, or just appreciating the music. They were attracted to Prabhupada's transcendental sound vibrations, and they came and they joined him. And that, in America at least, here Prabhupada didn't emphasize street sankirtan when the devotees first came here. He said that that they would not be so highly respected. This is when the devotees first came to Bombay. But in America and the other Western countries, Prabhupada very much encouraged the devotees to go out every day on Harinam Sankirtan. And that was our only activity, really. We would go out 6 to 8 hours a day, chanting on the streets. We would pick the most populated part of the cities, wherever we were, and just chant. And we had Back to Godhead magazines at that time, no books, only the magazines. Someone, if there were only 2 devotees, sometimes one person would take turns chanting, the other one would distribute books, then we switch places. If there were 10 devotees, then we'd all be chanting, and 1 or 2 people, whatever. We worked as a team to push on this Sankirtan movement of Lord Chaitanya. Wherever we went, this was our program that Prabhupada started here at Tompkins Square. And that was interesting too, the different ways in which people regarded the kirtan. Some people thought it was a prelude. That means something else was going to come after it. Some people thought it was a main event. Some people liked the music. Some people liked the poetic sound of it. Then Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky arrived, along with some of their friends. Allen surveyed the scene and found a seat among the chanters. With his black beard, his eyeglasses, his bald spot surrounded by long black ringlets of hair, Allen Ginsberg, the poet patriarch, come to join the chanting, greatly enhanced the local prestige of the kirtan. Prabhupada, while continuing his ecstatic chanting and drum playing, acknowledged Allen and smiled. So we can remember that Allen Ginsberg, he went to India before this, and he first came in contact with the chanting of Hare Krishna at the Kumbh Mela, and then it was reinforced when he visited Calcutta and he saw the Bengali kirtan singers there. He brought back with him a harmonium, and he would hold, this is during our time, when we all grew up in America, he would hold beans. Beans meant that he would go to a big park, like Central Park or the different big parts around the country, and he would start his beans by chanting Hare Krishna. And that chanting of Hare Krishna would go all over the park. So the people, just as Prabhupada was doing here, people would come by the hundreds to join him in chanting Hare Krishna. He only knew one tune that he had heard in Calcutta. He would always sing that one tune with his harmonium. Then when he met Prabhupada on the Lower East Side, he realized what he had been missing, because Prabhupada had so many beautiful tunes for chanting Hare Krishna. And Prabhupada appreciated Allen, and Allen especially appreciated Srila Prabhupada. So when Allen, who just lived nearby in the neighborhood, heard that this chanting was going on at Tompkins Square Park, he came and brought his friends too, and they joined in on the chanting. A reporter from the New York Times dropped by and asked Allen for an interview, but he refused. A man should not be disturbed while worshiping. The Times would have to wait. Allen, Tompkins Square Park was a hotbed of spiritual conflict in those days. So it was absolutely great. All of a sudden, in the midst of all the talk and drugs and theories, for some people to put their bodies, their singing, to break through the intellectual ice and come out with total bhakti, that was really amazing. So Allen knew enough to understand that Prabhupada had actually started a spiritual revolution of bhakti in America for the first time. That was why, through every single step since Allen Ginsberg heard about Prabhupada, came to 26 Second Avenue, he was always ready to assist Prabhupada. When Prabhupada had visa problems that wouldn't extend his visa, Allen Ginsberg went out of his way to get his visa extended. There's a book here. We've seen it before. This is called The Beginning. This was Prabhupada's 1966 journal or diary. And although we're not up to it yet, in the reading of Prabhupada Lilamrita, we'll hear in the near future about how Allen Ginsberg was able to help Prabhupada first in New York. He went all the way to Washington to get Prabhupada's extension. And then when Prabhupada was invited by his disciples to go to San Francisco, Allen Ginsberg also went and organized all the hippies to everybody bring a flower and welcome the Swami at the airport. So he really helped Prabhupada a lot. He was a real icon of the counterculture in those days. Prabhupada was striking to see. His brow was furrowed in the effort of singing loud, and his visage was strong. The veins in his temples stood out visibly, and his jaw jutted forward as he sang his Hare Krishna, for all to hear. Although his demeanor was pleasant, his chanting was intensive, sometimes straining, and everything about him was concentration. We didn't use loudspeakers. No, because we used our voice, we sang as loudly as we could, and then with so many people coming to join in, the sound itself, the volume, would increase naturally. It wasn't someone else's yoga retreat or silent peace vigil, but a pure chanting be-in of Prabhupada's own doing. It was a new wave, something everyone could take part in. The community seemed to be accepting it. It became so popular that the ice cream vendor came over to make sales. It's a proof of success. Just like our temple here. When we built this temple, there was nothing here. Absolutely nothing. We just had a dirt road on the side here, and the front road was about 6 feet wide. It was wide enough for one tanga to go back and forth between Chattikara and Vrindavan. No shops whatsoever. There was one little jhompuri, a little shack, and Bihari Lal, who was a young man at that time, he used to sell yogurt there, and he used to make lassis, because workers would come on their bicycles on the road, and that was it. No commercialism whatsoever. Now, what's going on here? So, proof. Where the people are, the sellers come, the vendors come. So we know we're very successful here. Beside Prabhupada, a group of young, blonde-haired boys, you can see them in the background here, 5 or 6 years old, were just sitting around. A young Polish boy stood staring. Someone began burning frankincense on a glowing coal in a metal strainer, and the sweet fumes billowed among the flutists, drummers, and chanters. Now, Prabhupada also liked the burning of frankincense, and he initiated that in Mayapur. Every evening, he would have the devotees burn the frankincense, bring it all over. We just had one building then, bring it all over. And then we brought that same burning of frankincense here to Prabhupada's room because it drives away the mosquitoes and the ghosts also. So Eve was there. Swamiji motioned to his disciples, and they got up and began dancing. Prabhupada gave a gesture of acceptance by a typically Indian movement of his head, and he raised his arms, inviting more dancers. The harmonium played a constant drone, and a boy wearing a military fatigue jacket improvised atonal creations on a wooden recorder. Yet the total sound of the instruments blended, and the Swamiji's voice emerged above the moaning tones of each chord. And so it went for hours. Prabhupada held his head and shoulders erect, although at the end of each line of the mantra, he would sometimes shrug his shoulders before he started the next line. His disciples stayed close by him, sitting on the same rug, religious ecstasy visible in their eyes. Finally, he stopped. Immediately he stood up, and they knew he was going to speak. It was 4 o'clock, and the warm autumn sun was still shining on the park. The atmosphere was peaceful, and the audience attentive and mellow from the concentration on the mantra. He began to speak to them, thanking everyone for joining in the kirtan. The chanting of Hare Krishna, he said, had been introduced 500 years ago in West Bengal by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Hare means, O energy of the Lord. Krishna is the Lord, and Ram is also a name of the Supreme Lord, meaning the highest pleasure. His disciples sat at his feet, listening. Rai Ram, squinting through his shielding hand, probably can't see, he's right over here. See that? That's Rai Ram. Into the sun to see Swamiji. And Kirtanananda's head was cocked to one side, like a bird's who was listening to the ground. He stood erect by the stout oak. Oak is a very strong tree that grows in the colder countries. His hands folded loosely before him in a proper speaker's posture, his light saffron robes covering him gracefully. The tree behind him seemed perfectly placed, and the sunshine dappled leafy shadows against the thick trunk. Behind him, through the grove of trees, was the steeple of St. Brigid's. There was a church right behind. We'll see in the other pictures. On his right was a dumpy, middle-aged woman, right over there, see, wearing a dress and hairdo that had been out of style in the United States for 25 years. On his left was a bold-looking hippie girl in tight denims, and beside her a young black man in a black sweater, his arms folded across his chest. Next was a young father holding an infant, then a bearded young street sadhu, his long hair parted in the middle, and two ordinary short-haired middle-class men and their young female companions. Many in the crowd, although standing close by, became distracted, looking off here and there. So Satsru Maharaj is going into real detail. First of all, he was present there. And second of all, it was to help us understand that everyone was attracted. All different backgrounds, all different ages. But just as when Prabhupada would start his lecture at 26 2nd Avenue, when the chanting and dancing stopped, people became distracted. And some of them weren't so interested when the lecture started. Prabhupada explained that there are three platforms: sensual, mental, and intellectual. And above them is the spiritual platform. The chanting of Hare Krishna is on the spiritual platform, and it is the best process for reviving our eternal, blissful consciousness. He invited everyone to attend the meetings at 26 2nd Avenue and concluded his brief speech by saying, "Thank you very much. Please chant with us." Then he sat down, took the drum, and began the kirtan again. So Prabhupada had already been chanting for about 4 hours. He wasn't ready to stop. So long as there were people to hear and to take part, he went on. If it were risky for a 71-year-old man to thump a drum and shout so loud, then he would take that risk for Krishna. It was too good to stop. He had come far from Vrindavan, survived the non-Krishna Yoga Society, waited all winter in obscurity. America had waited hundreds of years with no Krishna chanting. No Hare Krishna had come from Thoreau's or Emerson's appreciations, though they had pored over English translations of the Gita and Puranas. So Thoreau and Emerson, they were writers, they were philosophers, they were considered the American transcendentalists. And they had read Bhagavad Gita, they had extolled Bhagavad Gita, but no one knew what Krishna Bhakti was. They knew, of course, they were naturally attracted to the philosophy of yoga as so-called transcendentalists, but a Krishna Bhakti had not yet arrived in America. So it wasn't until Prabhupada came, gave the chanting of Hare Krishna, and began to explain the Bhagavad Gita as it is, that people then were able to take up Krishna consciousness. And no kirtan had come from Vivekananda's famous speech on behalf of Hinduism at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. So here in India, Vivekananda is considered a great emissary or cultural ambassador of India because he was the first sadhu, let's say, who was invited to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. And he was invited to speak there. It was like the first interfaith program there. And he, in his lecture, he welcomed everyone, that we were all brothers here. whatever our backgrounds are, whatever our beliefs are. And he was applauded for that, because it was the first time that a Hindu speaker had been invited to these world religious conferences. So when he came back to India, he was revered as the first person who had brought Vedic culture to the Western countries, although it was just a short speech that he had given. And after that, his followers came to America, set up different yoga societies, lecturing from his books and things like that. But there was no Krishna Bhakti. It wasn't until Srila Prabhupada personally came and began to speak the teachings of Lord Chaitanya and the actual teachings of Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita that Krishna consciousness or Krishna Bhakti took its roots in the Western countries. So now that he finally had Krishna Bhakti going, flowing like the Ganges to the sea, it could not stop. In his heart, he felt the infinite will of Lord Chaitanya to deliver the fallen souls. So what was that? Lord Chaitanya had predicted that in every town and village his name would be heard. And now, finally, that prediction was fructifying by Srila Prabhupada beginning this chanting of Hare Krishna in all the towns and villages of the world. He knew this was the desire of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his own spiritual master, even though caste-conscious Brahmins in India would disapprove of his associating with such untouchables as these drug-mad American meat-eaters and their girlfriends. But Swamiji explained that he was in full accord with the scriptures. The Bhagavatam had clearly stated that Krishna consciousness should be delivered to all races. Everyone was a spiritual soul, and regardless of birth, they could be brought to the highest spiritual platform by chanting the holy name. Never mind whatever sinful things they were doing. These people were perfect candidates for Krishna consciousness. Tompkins Square Park was Krishna's plan. It was also part of the earth. And these people were members of the human race. And the chanting of Hare Krishna was the dharma of the age. So we know that not only human beings, but Prabhupada explained that when you're chanting, all the living entities who hear the chanting, the trees, the bugs, the animals, as Lord Chaitanya demonstrated while going through the Jharkhand forest, and also Jagannath Das Babaji when he was walking to Bengal. Same thing happened. Tigers came, and his disciple, Bihari, he became frightened. But Jagannath Das Babaji explained to him that, no, these tigers have come to protect us. So the pure devotees, they understand that these, well, untouchables, drug-mad American meat-eaters and their girlfriends, well, they certainly wouldn't be accepted in the Vedic culture. But Srila Prabhupada, he saw everyone equally as spirit souls and candidates for receiving the holy name of Krishna. Walking back home in the early evening, past the shops and crowded tenements, followed by more than a dozen interested new people from the park, the Swami again sustained occasional shouts and taunts. But those who followed him from the park were still feeling the aura of an ecstasy that easily tolerated a few taunts from the street. Prabhupada especially was undisturbed. As he walked with his head high, not speaking, he was gravely absorbed in his thoughts. And yet his eyes actively noticed people and places and exchanged glances with those whom he passed on his way along 7th Street, past the churches and funeral homes, across 1st Avenue to the noisy, heavily trafficked 2nd Avenue, then down 2nd, past liquor stores, coin laundries, delicatessens, past the Iglesia Alianza Cristiana Missionera, the Kohinoor Intercontinental Restaurant Palace, then past the Church of Nativity, and finally back home to number 26. So again, Sasru Maharaj, he's giving us a little view of where Prabhupada was at that time. Such mixed cultures. You've got the liquor stores, you've got the funeral homes, you've got all different kinds of churches here and restaurants. And here was Prabhupada walking with his followers. They were so attracted that even new followers came and followed Prabhupada back to 26 Second Avenue. He was completely unaffected by his surroundings. He was doing his duty by carrying the mission of Lord Chaitanya now to the Western countries. A few days later, Rabindra Sarup was walking down 2nd Avenue on his way to the Swami's morning class when an acquaintance came out of the Gem Spa Candy and News store and said, "Hey, your Swami's in the newspaper, did you see?" "Yeah," Rabindra Sarup replied, "The New York Times." "No," his friend said, "today." And he held up a copy of the latest edition of the East Village Other. The front page was filled with a two-color photo of the Swami, his hands folded decorously at his waist, standing in yellow robes in front of the big tree in Tompkins Square Park. He was speaking to a small crowd that had gathered around, and his disciples were at his feet. The big steeple of St. Bridget's formed a silhouette behind him. Above the photo was the single headline, "Save Earth Now," and beneath was the mantra, "Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare." Below the mantra were the words, "See centerfold." That was the whole front page. Now, we have just gotten this. We just opened a museum about Prabhupada's legacy in Mayapur, and someone donated this particular copy of the East Village Other. And the front cover, I mean, everyone in the village would read this. This was the local newspaper. So they all got to read the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. They all got to see Prabhupada. And then in the centerfold was a 2-page article. It was a fanciful article. We'll hear part of it now. But the point is that this is Lord Krishna helping Prabhupada. He got free publicity from the biggest newspaper in the area, and all about what Prabhupada was doing, where the temple was, the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. The devotees didn't even know that the article was printed. Just an acquaintance happened to tell Rabindra Sarup. This is how Krishna works. Rabindra Sarup took the newspaper and opened to the center, where he found a long article and a large photo of Swamiji with his left hand on his head, grinning blissfully in an unusual, casual moment. So this is when you can see the oak tree behind Prabhupada. This is when he was at the park here. His friend gave him the paper, and Rabindra Sarup hurried to Swamiji. When he reached the storefront, several boys went along with him to show Swamiji the paper. "Look," Rabindra Sarup handed it over. "This is the biggest local newspaper. Everybody reads it." Swamiji opened his eyes wide. He read aloud, "Save Earth Now." Was it an ecological pun? Was it a reference to staving off nuclear disaster? Was it poking fun at Swamiji's evangelism? So, Save Earth Now. Whoever wrote the article could understand that Prabhupada was doing something that was going to save the earth. And because with the donation in the museum, it was the entire newspaper. So we were looking through the whole newspaper, all rubbish, all about drugs and LSD and all this other nonsense. But there, right on the front cover was Prabhupada, and right in the centerfold was this 2-page big article all about Prabhupada. It was wonderful. Well, said Umapati, after all, this is the East Village other. It could mean anything. Yeah, it could mean because the people who even wrote who edited it, they were the editors, they were all pro LSD and pro pot, which is marijuana. But there they were, glorifying Srila Prabhupada in their newspaper. Swamiji is saving the earth, Kirtananda said. We are trying to, Prabhupada replied, by Krishna's grace. Methodically, he put on the eyeglasses he usually reserved for reading the Bhagavatam and carefully appraised the page from top to bottom. The newspaper looked incongruous in his hands. Prabhupada wouldn't normally read the newspaper, he would read the Bhagavatam. Then he began turning the pages. He stopped at the centerfold and looked at the picture of himself and laughed, then paused, studying the article. So, he said, read it. He handed the paper to Hayagriva. So this article, it started out like a story. Once upon a time, Hayagriva began loudly. As he was an English professor, he knew how to dramatize his reading. It was a fanciful story of a group of theologians who had killed an old man in a church, and of the subsequent press report that God was now dead. But the story went on. Some people didn't believe it. They had dug up the body and found it to be not the body of God, but that of his PR man, his public relations man, organized religion. Because in the hippie culture, one of the main things that they were revolting against was organized religion. They saw it as hypocritical, and they wanted to find other cultures that has some truth and meaning in the religions. So the PR man was organized religion. At once, the good tidings swept across the wide world. God lives, but where was God? Hayagriva read dramatically to an enthralled group. A full-page ad in the New York Times, this is still part of the article, a full-page ad in the New York Times offering a reward for information leading to the discovery of the whereabouts of God, and signed by Martin Luther King and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. Brought no response. Nobody knew where God was, even though they were offering a reward to find him. God, said some people, lives in a sugar cube. Now, what is a sugar cube? When you take LSD, which is the hallucinogenic, we've talked about it many times and all the effects and everything. It's just a drop of a chemical. You can't really take the drop. So what they do is they either put the drop on a piece of paper and you put the paper in your mouth, or they put the drop on a little cube of sugar. And then you just take the sugar cube and you get the effects of the intoxication from that. So some people, according to them, God lived in a sugar cube, because when they would take this hallucinogenic drug, they were hallucinating, thinking that they were having spiritual realizations, but it was just temporary hallucinations. Others whispered that the sacred secret was in a cigarette. Okay, so cigarettes, we also talked about these things. All of you are getting hippie education from these classes, that they would take charas, and they would take a cigarette paper and make these, they're called joints, right? So, and they would smoke these so-called cigarettes and also become intoxicated. But while all this was going on, an old man, 1 year past his allotted 70, wandered into New York's East Village and set about to prove to the world that he knew where God could be found. In only 3 months, the man, Swami A.C. Bhaktivedanta, succeeded in convincing the world's toughest audience, bohemians, acid heads, potheads, and hippies. So bohemians, they were the counterculture who rejected modern civilization. And the acid heads were the people who took the LSD, which is called acid. And the potheads were the people who took the charas in the cigarettes. So now you all have your hippie vocabulary. You can understand all these things now. And hippies also. And he knew the way to God. Now, turn on, tune in, and drop out. That was Timothy Leary's mantra. Turn on means take intoxication, tune into your hallucinations, and then drop out of modern society. So this is what the hippies' motto was, their mantra. Turn on, tune in, drop out. But the article says Prabhupada's mantra was turn off, sing out, and fall in. This new brand of holy man, with all due deference to Dr. Leary was the professor who popularized the taking of LSD, acid. With all due respect to deference to Dr. Leary, has come forth with a brand of consciousness expansion that's sweeter than acid. Remember, acid's in the sugar cube. Cheaper than pot, because you'd have to buy the illicit charas and things like that. And non-bustable by fuzz. So non-bustable by, here's another thing you have to learn. Fuzz means the police. And the police would always be looking for the drug takers, and especially the drug dealers. And when they would find them and capture them, in hippie jargon, that's called bust. When they would bust the drug dealers, right? So non-bustable by fuzz means that you could get high from chanting Hare Krishna and the police wouldn't bother you. How is all this possible? Through Krishna, the Swami says. The boys broke into cheers and applause. Achyutananda apologized to Swamiji for the language of the article. It's the hippie newspaper. That's all right, said Prabhupada. He has written it in his own way. But he has said that we are giving God. They are saying that God is dead, but it is false. We are directly presenting, here is God. Who can deny it? So many theologians and people may say there is no God, but the Vaishnav hands God over to you freely, as a commodity. Here is God. So he has marked this. It is very good. So we have 2 minutes left, and I brought this book because being Prabhupada's diary, by this time, because this was October, for instance, this article, it's printed every 2 weeks. So this article is October 15th to November 1st. So that means that already the first initiation and the second initiation had taken place. That means 12 plus 16 disciples initiated at that time. And then a few days on October 23rd, another 2 disciples, Gargamuni and Ranshur, were initiated. Prabhupada discusses this all in his diary. We haven't gotten that part yet because Satsrup Maharaj is giving us a full description. So Hayagriva, he wrote a poem. I'm going to read this poem to you because Prabhupada was appreciating that even though it was hippie language, they have described that God exists in their own jargon. So Hayagriva, he wrote this poem. It's called Second Avenue Samadhi. Standing outside the storefront of Swamiji's Society for Krishna Consciousness, I look up and down Manhattan's 2nd Avenue at derelicts, Puerto Ricans, and sundry fruitive laborers and wonder. Hare Krishna, I think, and look at the Cosmos Parcels Express Corporation sign across the way like the very cosmos itself in its white and green aggression, and at the Gonzalez Funeral Home and Witzner Brothers Memorials Corporation's heavy tombstones broadcasting death to all, and at the Red Star Bar's Seagram 7 sign blinking red and yellow relief for exhausted karmis, poor fruitive laborers. Hare Krishna, I think, and walk down the sidewalk past the revolving red, white, and blue mobile gasoline sign buzzing and ringing bells of gas pumps feeding the dumb steel chariots of Detroit. Now, if people don't understand this, I can explain it. Dumb steel chariots of Detroit. Detroit is the car manufacturing center of America. So the cars, he's calling them dumb steel chariots. And gasoline, here it's called petrol. In America, it's called gasoline. And next to the 26th 2nd Avenue was a petrol pump, which is called a gasoline station, right? Hare Krishna, Hare Ram, I think, wondering what Swamiji must think of, in parentheses, God bless America. Because originally, America was formed for the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to the pursuit of happiness. And on all American money, the motto is, "In God we trust." So it was formed on God consciousness. You don't find that on the Indian money, "In God we trust," right? So America had a religious background, but here, God bless America, it was more or less not so blessed in those days when Prabhupada was there. And walk on down the sidewalk, silent cigarette butts that stare up like little crushed universes of capitalism. So we read that Peter Epstein, who got initiated, Bill Epstein, he wasn't exactly fully devoted, so when he would go out onto the streets and he would pick up cigarette butts. That means people would smoke the cigarettes, and when it was down to here, they would just throw it on the ground. He would pick them up, light them, and re-smoke them. So he's talking about these cigarette butts that are on the ground that are sticking up all over the place. And think, Hare Krishna, on the corner of Houston Street and 2nd Avenue, where I stand a long time thinking, Hare Krishna, hands in my pockets and watching the dying sunlight fade over buildings and off the far silver parapets of the Brooklyn Bridge that reaches over the river like an altar to Krishna. So anyone who has been in New York City, how many people here have been in New York City? We have a New Yorker sitting right here, Maharaj. He grew up in New York City, but somehow he escaped, and here he is in Vrindavan now. So very hard to remember Krishna, but here he calls it 2nd Avenue Samadhi. So everything Hayagriva was looking at, he was trying to Krishnaize by Prabhupada's magic touch. And in that way, we have this poem of how he sees all of the miserable things all around the temple, which is just like the spiritual world for them, and how now with his spiritual vision, he's converting all of that into the philosophy that Prabhupada has taught him. Okay, we'll continue next week. All glories to Srila.